Felix Carter stood silently in his office, eyes locked on the latest employee turnover report. The numbers staring back at him weren't just bad, they were catastrophic. In the logistics industry, some level of turnover was to be expected, a natural ebb and flow. But this location? It was an outlier. Resignation requests had spiked overnight, productivity had plummeted, and complaints about management had become a storm he could no longer ignore. The data didn't add up. Not to the culture he had built, not to the values he had stood by. 10 years ago, Felix had bought the company with nothing but determination and a vision. From the ground up, he built an empire of 12 distribution centers across the region, each founded on the simple principles of fair wages, transparency, and mutual respect. He didn't just build a business, he cultivated a belief that people, not profits, were the backbone of success. But what was happening here, this wasn't what he had nurtured. This wasn't his legacy. He had been receiving updates from his regional manager regularly, always filled with optimistic figures and vague explanations. But Felix had been in this game long enough to know when something was being swept under the rug. The pit in his stomach wasn't suspicion. It was instinct. The kind that only comes from a man who's walked every mile of his own journey, who knows the soul of his business like the lines in his own palm. There was only one way to get the truth. A week later, Felix returned to that same warehouse, only this time not as the CEO, but as a new hire named Frank. His disguise was subtle but effective. A thicker pair of glasses, a neatly trimmed beard, and a short, nondescript haircut. He was just another blue-collar worker trying to make ends meet. No one here had seen him in person. To them, he was invisible. Just another set of hands moving boxes, blending into the background. The first few hours were brutal. The warehouse was severely understaffed. Tasks were relentless, and expectations unforgiving. Frank, struggled to keep up with the relentless pace. Sweat dripped down his back within minutes. His muscles ached, his breath short. But none of that shook him nearly as much as the atmosphere did. The people around him moved like ghosts, quiet, distant, hollowed out by fatigue. There was no camaraderie, no jokes, no small talk, just long silences and the mechanical rhythm of labor. It was as if the soul had been drained out of the place, leaving behind only obligation and exhaustion. Then he met Rick. Rick was the warehouse manager, the one who had been described in reports as highly efficient. But what Felix saw was anything but. Rick strutted across the warehouse floor like a prison warden, cold, sharp, and heavy with authority. He didn't lift a finger to help. He barked orders like they were commands in boot camp. Workers flinched when he approached. Their shoulders stiffened. Their eyes dropped to the floor. "Frank, move faster," Rick snapped when Felix slowed down to catch his breath. Felix nodded, swallowing the urge to push back. He hadn't come here to argue. He was here to witness, to absorb every inch of truth hidden beneath the numbers, and what he saw cut deeper than he expected. It wasn't just poor leadership. It was emotional erosion, the kind that leaves scars you can't see but can feel in every strained movement, every unspoken word. During his lunch break, Felix sat alone in a corner of the break room. Conversations were hushed and fragmented, as if fear had soaked into the walls. But even in that silence, he caught bits and pieces, words that hung in the air like weight too heavy to carry. "If I ask for one more day off, Rick's gonna slash my hours again. Had to pick up 2 extra shifts this week, just to make rent. No one gives a damn how hard we work." Each sentence was like a punch to the chest. Each voice was another crack in the foundation of a place that had once stood for something better. Felix looked around and realized these weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These were lives. And they were breaking. Each word Felix heard hit him like a dagger, sharp, precise, and sinking deep into his chest. Everything about this place contradicted his beliefs, stood in stark opposition to the core values he had built his company on. It wasn't just disappointment he felt. It was betrayal. As the shift neared its end, Felix headed to the back of the warehouse to grab a box. But as he approached the stack of pallets, he froze. A quiet, muffled sob echoed faintly through the air. He paused, straining to listen. It was unmistakable. Someone was crying, softly, almost as if trying to keep it hidden. Stepping carefully around the pallets, he found her. A young woman sitting on the floor, her head buried in her arms, her back curled in on itself like she was trying to disappear. In that moment, time seemed to stop. Felix hesitated, but something inside him, the part that refused to look away from pain, pushed him forward. "Hey," he said gently, "are you okay?" The woman startled, her head snapping up. Her name tag read Hannah Wills. Her eyes were red, cheeks damp. For a moment she looked like she might deny everything. "Fine," she murmured, brushing the tears away quickly. Felix crouched down beside her, keeping his voice low and steady. "You don't look fine." Hannah exhaled, shaky and uneven. Then, suddenly, like a dam giving way, she whispered through a cracked voice, "I can't do this anymore." Felix's hands tightened slightly, his voice calm but serious. "Can't do what?" She glanced around as if terrified someone might be listening. Then, almost too quietly to hear, she said, "This job, the way Rick treats us, we're forced to work extra hours, no days off. I haven't had a single day off in 2 weeks. He keeps saying we're short-staffed but won't hire anyone." A quiet rage began to simmer in Felix's chest, but what hit him harder was the sorrow, the realization that people like Hannah, good people, were being crushed under a system that he believed had been built to protect them. This wasn't just overwork. It was systematic erosion of energy, dignity, and hope. "It's not right." Hannah let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "Nobody cares. I tried going to corporate once, just once, but Rick found out. He cut my hours for an entire month, said I needed to learn my place." Felix's fingers curled into tight fists. His nails dug into his palms. A part of him shattered inside. He had trusted Rick, given him full control of this warehouse, believing the man shared his philosophy of fairness and respect. But this wasn't discipline or efficiency. It was manipulation, abuse masked as leadership. Hannah exhaled again, her breath still trembling as if she were walking out of a storm that had nearly swallowed her. "I was going to quit today," she said softly, "but I need the money." Felix stared at her for a long moment, not as a boss, but as a human being, someone standing face to face with injustice. Hannah wasn't just another worker. She was a dedicated person on the edge of burnout, and Felix knew this couldn't go on, not another day. He rose to his feet, drawing in a steady breath. His voice, though gentle, was resolute. "You're not alone, I promise. Things will change." Hannah looked at him with eyes full of skepticism and exhaustion. "Rick does whatever he wants. He runs this place like he's a king." Felix's gaze hardened, not for much longer. He turned and walked away, leaving her behind the pallets. But his mind was racing. Every doubt he'd had was now confirmed by a name, a voice, and a tear-streaked face. This wasn't mismanagement. It was systemic abuse. A culture of fear had been allowed to fester and rot what was once built on dignity. For the rest of the shift, Felix threw himself into the work. He blended in, eyes and ears wide open. He noticed how employees avoided Rick, how their bodies tensed when he came near. There were no words of encouragement, only orders, loud, sharp, and cold. Mistakes, no matter how minor, were punished in full view, not corrected, humiliated. Later, when a conveyor belt jammed, Felix saw just how deep the fear ran. Lewis, one of the workers, stood frozen, eyes flicking toward Rick's office. He didn't move. Felix walked over, feigning confusion. "What's going on?" Louis kept his voice to a near whisper. "It does this sometimes, but if we stop everything, Rick loses it." Felix frowned. "Wouldn't it be worse to let it back up?" Lewis sighed, defeated. "That's not how he sees it. Just be careful, okay?" Felix nodded slowly, locking eyes with Lewis for a moment. There was a fear in that man's gaze, a fear born from being punished for doing the right thing, and it was that fear that kept this entire machine running. When the shift finally ended, Felix volunteered to stay behind and help clean up, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to hear more, and what he heard echoed the same tune. Long hours, endless stress, and a manager who ruled by retaliation. No openness, no compassion, only consequences. As he walked past Rick's office on his way out, Felix heard the manager's voice bark through the cracked door. "No more excuses. If you can't handle the extra shift, I'll find someone who can." A woman's voice responded, tense but trying to remain composed. "I've worked 6 straight days. I need a break." "You need this job more." Felix stopped in his tracks. Through the narrow gap in the door, he saw a middle-aged woman, her face strained with frustration. Rick sat comfortably, one leg crossed over the other, arms folded, his expression disturbingly indifferent. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said coldly. The woman clenched her fists, then gave a stiff nod and walked away, swallowing her anger like it was something she was used to doing far too often. Felix didn't need any more proof. This wasn't leadership. This was control through fear and intimidation. The chill in the night air did little to cool the fire growing in Felix's chest. He had built this company on the belief that employees were its foundation. He had trusted Rick, but now that trust lay in pieces, shattered by the reality of what Rick had done. Tomorrow, everything would change. The next morning, Felix returned to the warehouse with a resolve as solid as steel. He wasn't Frank anymore, the tired new worker blending in. He was Felix Carter, the founder of this company. And he was here to reclaim the values he once instilled. The warehouse floor hadn't changed. It was still tense, heavy, drained of life. The workers moved efficiently, yes, but without any spark. Near the loading area, Felix spotted Hannah. She didn't notice him, but her posture spoke volumes. Dragging feet, dark circles under her eyes, the body language of someone long used to sacrificing herself for a paycheck that barely covered the basics. He wasn't going to let another day go by like this. Felix walked straight into Rick's office without knocking. Rick looked up, clearly irritated. "What do you think you're doing?" Felix shut the door behind him and locked eyes with the man. "I'm Felix Carter." Shock spread across Rick's face, quickly replaced by wariness. "What?" Felix removed his glasses and placed them on the desk. "I own this company, and I've spent the last 2 days working under you." Rick's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Felix didn't wait for a response. "I've seen how you run this warehouse. I've heard the way you talk to employees. I've watched them shrink back, too afraid to report issues. I've listened to them cry because they feel trapped in a place they once thought held opportunity." Rick tried to push back, his voice shaky. "I don't know what you think you saw, but..." "I saw enough," Felix cut him off, his tone sharp as a blade. "They're overworked, scared, forced to take on endless shifts because you won't hire more help. That's not the company I built." Rick scoffed, defensive. "You don't understand how hard it is to keep things running. I do what's necessary." "Necessary?" Felix's eyes narrowed. "Cutting hours when someone speaks up, ignoring cries for help, driving them into exhaustion? That's not leadership. That's abuse." Rick leaned forward, voice desperate but firm. You wanted efficiency. I delivered the numbers. Felix stayed calm, but his words had steel behind them. Numbers don't build a business, people do, and you're driving them away. Rick opened his mouth, but Felix didn't let him speak. Your time here is over. Rick's eyes widened, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. You're firing me? Felix's voice held no room for argument. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out, and I will make sure you don't set foot in this building again. Rick let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head like it was all a joke. You think getting rid of me will fix everything? These workers are lazy. If no one pushes them, nothing gets done. Felix took a step closer, voice low but firm. They don't need to be pushed. They need to be respected, and that's something you were never capable of giving them. Rick exhaled, the fight finally draining from his body. He grabbed his coat without another word, muttered something under his breath, and walked out. Felix followed close behind. As Rick stepped onto the warehouse floor, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eyes turned, conversations stopped. Everyone sensed something had shifted. Felix paused in the center of the floor and raised his voice, clear and steady. Rick is no longer with this company. Silence. Then, an almost imperceptible change. Some people exhaled. Others looked at each other, disbelief and tentative relief washing over them. Felix scanned the crowd, faces he had passed by before but never truly seen. Now, for the first time, he really looked, and they were watching back. I know this place has had problems, Felix continued, and I take full responsibility. I put my trust in the wrong person and let things go unchecked for far too long. But starting today, that changes. A few workers began stepping forward hesitantly, still unsure if what they were hearing was real. Felix turned toward Hannah. She stood frozen, her face unreadable, but in her eyes a faint flicker of something else appeared. A spark. Small but alive. No one should have to live in fear at their job. No one should have to choose between survival and their mental well-being. That ends now. Hannah swallowed hard, glancing around, then slowly nodded. It was a small gesture, but Felix felt the weight behind it. Hope, fragile but awakening. He turned back to the group. We're hiring more staff immediately. No more mandatory overtime. And if any of you have something to say, bring it to me. Directly. The tension in the air began to soften. A few quiet sighs of relief drifted across the floor. Lewis, the same worker who had been too afraid to report a conveyor belt malfunction, spoke up. Are you really going to change all this? Felix met his gaze. Yes, and I'll personally be checking to make sure of it. A ripple moved through the warehouse. Not full trust yet, Felix knew, but it was something. A beginning. As the shift continued, Felix didn't return to the office. He moved among the workers, lifting boxes, asking questions. Not small talk, real questions, and he got real answers. Equipment hadn't been maintained. Employees had been pushed into roles outside their job descriptions with no compensation. Some had considered quitting, but stayed only because they had nowhere else to go. Later in the day, Felix found Hannah near the shipping area, double-checking a manifest. She looked up briefly, then back down, silent. He leaned against a nearby rail, voice soft. You almost quit yesterday. She stiffened, then gave a small nod. I wouldn't have blamed you, Felix said. But I'm glad you stayed. Hannah gripped the papers tighter in her hands. I didn't think anything would actually change. I really didn't. Felix nodded sincerely. I understand. After everything. Why would you? I should have seen it sooner. I won't let it happen again. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, she set the paperwork down and asked, Why did you do it? Pretend to be a worker. Felix paused. The reports, the excuses, they had felt so empty. I couldn't see the truth anymore. I needed to hear it, see it for myself. And now I have. Hannah gave a small nod. Not full belief, but the beginning of it. That night, Felix was the last to leave. The warehouse was quiet. No conveyor hum, no footsteps. He stood alone, hands in his pockets, staring up at the ceiling. The building looked the same, but something had changed. Deep inside, a shift had begun. The next morning, Felix arrived before the first shift. A temporary manager would be in place by next week, but for now he would remain. Present, accountable, involved. The energy on the floor felt different. Eyes still wary, but footsteps a little lighter. No one spoke of it, but Felix sensed it. Trust was starting to take root. He moved through each department, talking to people, listening. Though Rick was gone, the traces of his reign lingered. Nervous glances before someone spoke, hesitation before expressing an idea. Midway through the shift, he saw Hannah again, focused on reviewing shipping weights. "All good?" he asked, keeping a respectful distance so he wouldn't startle her. She didn't look up. "There's a slight discrepancy in the numbers. I'm correcting it before it goes out." "You always this thorough?" he asked, half teasing. She paused, then shrugged. Rick hated mistakes, even if they weren't our fault. Easier to fix them early than deal with him later. Felix exhaled slowly. "No one should have to work in fear." She didn't respond right away. Then, finally, she turned to him. "Are you really staying here until things change?" "N," Felix said without hesitation. She studied him, searching his face. Then, for the first time, she handed him her clipboard. "If you're staying, might as well help me check these numbers." Felix took it without question. A small gesture, but it was a breakthrough. The shift continued, but the atmosphere had clearly changed. Felix moved through every corner of the warehouse, making notes, asking questions. One worker admitted he'd been denied a raise for 3 years. Another revealed Rick had altered clock-in records to avoid paying overtime. In mid-shift, Felix walked into Rick's former office and called the corporate leadership team. The conversation was short but firm. Scheduling policy overhaul, a full payroll audit, and a review of every unresolved complaint from the last 12 months. When he stepped back out, the workers were watching him, not with fear, but with expectation. No speech, Felix simply walked up to Lewis and handed him a clipboard. "I want a list of everything that's been ignored, equipment, policies, anything that's been swept under the rug." Lewis blinked, caught off guard. "You really want to know all of it?" "Every detail." Lewis looked at him, then nodded. By the end of that shift, something had undeniably changed. It wasn't just hope anymore, it was participation. People were speaking up. Problems once hidden were finally being voiced. Felix locked the warehouse that evening in silence. He knew the path ahead would be long, but for the first time in a very long time, this place wasn't a factory run by fear. It was a workplace beginning to wake up. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Moments of Quiet Truth, where we believe that the human spirit is never truly defeated, only waiting to rise.